Located in beautiful downtown Baltimore at 112 East Lexington Street, Next Phase Cafe offers a comfortable and decorative atmosphere that will satisfy everyone's palate. If you're stopping in for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you'll find it a very unique experience. Next Phase specializes in great Southern cuisine such as crab cakes, bayou pasta, catfish, barbecue ribs, and of course this famous cornbread, all prepared for by a professional and courteous staff. So for a great meal, great entertainment, great drinks, and just a great time with some great people, stop in at Next Phase Cafe. For more information, call 410-449-3232 or visit our website at www.nextphasecafe.com.
The history of the black church in America is a long and complicated one. To understand the origins of this unique religious tradition, one needs to look back at the churches that the black church came out of, the Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian denominations. During the early years of slavery, some enslaved people organized secret meetings in the woods to worship. These secret meetings were the beginning of the black church. One of the earliest recorded black churches in America was founded in 1773 by a Georgian slave and Baptist preacher named George Layla, who began preaching to slaves in his spare time. His preaching became so popular that he founded the first African Baptist church, which is recognized as one of the oldest black churches in America. Perhaps the most well-known black church in America is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1816 by another Georgian preacher, Richard Allen, a former slave who purchased his own freedom and founded the AME Church in response to the racism and discrimination within the Methodist Church. But religious scholars say that the most significant influence on the development of the black church was the Great Awakening, a religious revival that swept through the American colonies in the 18th century. This movement emphasized the importance of personal salvation, individual religious experience, and the value of emotional and spontaneous worship. It's a style of worship that is common in the black church today. These early churches were also involved in the fight against slavery, playing an important role in the Underground Railroad and insurrections. Black churches continue to play a vital role in the struggle for civil and human rights, once the center of organizing and activism. It was a safe space for people to gather and plan. Many served as a base for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the Urban League, and the Black Panther Party. When StraightNoChaser returns, we'll be discussing the black church today with three prominent active pastors from the Maryland region. We'll be right back.
It's not our thing.
Thank you for coming back and joining us here to StraightNoChaser. I'm your host, Michael Eugene Johnson, and we're here with Reverend Dr. Kevin Slayton Sr., the pastor at Northwood Uphold United Methodist Church, Dr. Sheraton Todd Yearly, senior pastor at Douglas Memorial Community Church, and interim pastor with Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, Bishop Smith, right?
Yes.
All righty. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It is a pleasure for me. I am very familiar with everyone here, and all of the work that you do in the community is very, very important. You know, we've just come out of a pandemic. We've got some issues within our community. We know that the history of the Black church is a proud history. I'm a product of the Black church as well, coming out with my parents being the youngest of 11 in my family. So it was a march to church, as we would always say, going back to the Greater Gethsemane days of my mother and Cornerstone Baptist Church for my daddy, both coming out of the South at that time. But I guess I see things a little differently today, maybe by getting grayer and older, but I also see things differently about the way that the church moves through our community. And Pastor Yearly, what is it, or what is the church today, or the Black church today in the 21st century? Is it, where do we go from here?
Well, Brother Michael, thank you for having us. The question, where do we go from here, is really the lingering seminal question that Dr. King raised. Where do we go from here, chaos or community, in terms of identifying and determining what is going to be the trajectory for not just the Black community, but the community writ large. The Black church has been in the mix of what's going on in life. You mentioned the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, whether it was dealing with the lack of testing in underserved communities, whether it was connecting folks to vaccines once vaccines became available, looking at the economic infrastructure to support families that were already at risk, making sure you didn't have displacement of families who were relying on government support, but also needed to make sure they had a roof over their heads. That was part of the mix of the Black church. It doesn't often get publicized, but what we have to remember is that as an institution, as a collective, the Black church is still the most significant anchor institution in communities all across the country, and probably the most economically relevant institution when it comes to the corporate economics of Black folk. And so when we talk about where is the Black church, it is really at ground zero for much of what affects the lives of Black people in real time.
Bishop, you know, we're moving into the 21st century now. We got AI, and we've got all of these computers, and we've got a lot of churches that have not recovered from the pandemic. And a lot of folks are watching services now online. What does that do to the message of the Black church within the community, as the pastor has said? I mean, how does that translate now into the community? Because growing up, there might have been times when the church doors were open, there were a lot of activities going on. But what happens today with all of this, I guess you would say, new stuff?
Well, today is definitely a different dynamic because of the pandemic has pushed forward, I would say, technology and how we get the message out, or even how we impact the community where we are now, where we all exist. But it created a dynamic that was challenging for our older community. So it created education that needed to be fostered with many of our seniors who did not know how to use, Cash App if it came to offering, or have the virtual viewings on their phones or devices, where many of them don't have devices. So one of the things I have seen is that we've had to equip and empower, which is one of the two biggest things for me, with our community. Our seniors, we had to provide them with laptops, but we also had to provide them with training, how to use them. Many of them don't even have Wi-Fi. So even with that, assisting with getting them resources for Wi-Fi that are for seniors, that are low cost, that they didn't even know about, so that they can still be a part of what is going on in the Black church, what is a very vital part of their very existence. For many of them, church has been all that they've had, that they've fallen back on. And to eliminate that disconnection, we had to find ways to connect. And I think the church has done well in that arena to make sure that that connection is still there. However, where we are now, even when you're speaking to the 21st century, and the black church within the black community, the pandemic, so to speak, is over. But people are not returning back to the building. Because now what the AI and technology and the pandemic has created is a sense of convenience to be able to just stay home. And that's not just for our seniors, that's for our young adults and our young adults who have children. So you don't have that return back to the space that has been very sacred, the fellowship, the embracing of one another, to provide that on-hand support, as Pastor Yeary has already alluded to and mentioned. And so we're still having to, from what I've seen, be creative to how we impact our various social groups, our various genders, our various age groups, to make sure that the black church is still relevant for them and where they are and where we are.
Well, Dr. Slayton, it's also really important to recognize that now that we have Black Lives Matter and all of some of these leads of some of our social justice programs, I don't see a lot of the black church. And I've seen you and the two men that we have here participate in a lot of things. I've seen you participate in the housing issues and things out of the community. Where do the activists come? Do the activists come back to the church again? I mean, are they coming to the church, or are they really taking their activism more to the streets and not letting the church lead as the church has led before?
Historically, the church has been a leader in that area, but I think most will agree those movements have always been led by a younger generation. Mm-hmm. I think we're at a place since 1996 with the passing of charitable choice language under the Clinton administration, which was policy designed to unblur the line of what we would call separation of church and state. And in so doing it, I would argue that it has neutered that prophetic and advocate voice of the black church. Here's what I mean. Historically, Miss Johnson, who lives across the street from First Baptist, she passes and leaves Mr. Johnson with 6 children. The church just walked across the street and tried to address whatever the needs were Miss Johnson had. Possibly, Mr. Johnson had possibly even providing a new Miss Johnson, but the food, the clothing, whatever it is was provided. Charitable choice comes along, and in its attempt to unblur that line, it created pockets whereby churches felt the attention of not being able to be, one, certified to do that type of work or accredited. And quite honestly, they were competing with the church down the street that got a grant to do that type of work. And so once you begin to get that type of nuance and play with policy and the role of particularly the traditional black church, you layer that with the influence and the repeated cyclical visits for political involvement now, that voice has really been sidelined a lot because churches normally don't engage in ways that they don't want to upset the leadership, upset the apple cart, if you will.
Well, do you think that church and government is too involved now? Is it more mixing or less mixing?
It's definitely more mixing than it was before, and it's at our detriment.
Because why would it be? If the government is the bank and the church could be the teller, so to speak, and they say, I can help you out, how is it too much? Is it too much because of the way the government stands?
Well, there's never been a season that I'm aware of where anything was given for free. There's always an expectation.
Yes.
And when you begin to play that game within faith communities, you can see the demise. There's certain parts of this city you can run through over the last 25, 30 years, and the only new development you've seen are faith-based institutions. And then again, when we're talking about this political cyclical visits, you never see candidates seeking political office visiting mosques or synagogues or temples. They traditionally go to the black church because the black church, they believe, has a power and a sense of a prophetic voice that can move people. And I just quite frankly, I think it's been manipulated with the politics of the day, and it's neutered that voice.
But the politics of the day, if we go back to the Bush administration, Bush 43, and the establishment of an office of faith-based outreach, if you will, when the federal government began to present itself as being open to kind of this engagement, it imposed itself in kind of being selective. It created this hierarchy of preference. The truth of the matter is that most black churches during that time were very suspicious of the federal government even coming up with the program. Number one, we operate practically, not necessarily technically. What that means is that you have this committee of well-meaning folks who keep track of the revenues of the church on ledgers, writing down in spiral-bound notebooks, making sure that everything functions right, and you have an ad hoc committee of folks who are really just trying to give back to make sure that this collective enterprise called the church can continue to thrive. And so there was this opportunity that really kind of exploited the sense that black churches had often been left behind anyway in this conversation of the relationship between government, except when it came to protest. We can come back and talk to that. Because that was the framework, there was this suspicion. What does the government want from me? And is this a ploy by the government? Not like we haven't had a basis for conspiracy theories in the first place. It wasn't our imagination. The truth of the matter was we did not necessarily want to be in relationship with the federal government when it came around money, because we saw it as a ploy that the government might try to come take the last best anchor of hope and sustainability that we had had over time. So part of it is, I think, an unwillingness and even a suspicion of the process. And then at the same time, you see this reemergence of this notion of the evangelical movement, the religious right coming in to kind of establish itself as really the go-to part, the carve-out of this kind of church movement to be able to kind of speak to the issues that affect black and white folk.
And I guess, Bishop, what it does for me is there's a lot of problems we have in our communities. There's a lot going on. And I don't see the activism. Maybe I don't see the activism in mass. Maybe if I can say it that way, I don't see the activism in mass. Growing up, when one group of ministers made a point or said this is what we were going to do, that's how we moved in the community. Today, it seems like that a lot of, it's more about the church than the movement, if that sounds right. And, you know, it's more about, and I think that Dr. Slater had said it very well, because if you see the majority of renovation or the majority of construction in our communities, primarily are senior buildings or buildings that are coming from the church. Not that there's a problem with that, because we want our older citizens to be able to stay in the city if they wish to. You know, I don't have, people say about gentrification, I think of migration when I think of the movement of black people in this city. So is it that the churches has not, or to make it easy, because I can't blanket it, is it that the churches are now moving more towards individualism, or are the churches working together?
Definitely, I would say, more towards individualism. And this will be before pandemic. Even the matters that were already brought to the table, government is only part of the issue. There is an issue in the church. And let's just keep it real and 100. We have pastors who fight against pastors. We have churches who peg one to be better than the other church. From my perspective, even coming back to Baltimore in 2017, and I don't know how this will be taken, but Baltimore has become a personality-driven community or culture when it even comes to churches and pastoring. And so with that in part being said, we're missing the mark of impact in the community. For years, historically, the community came to the church, and we didn't wrestle to get the people in. They were there. The church had prevalent position in the community. There was a level of respect that existed that was in the ideal, the mindsets of the community, whether you were churched or unchurched. But now, and since the past, just with me being home, since 2017, there is more of this individualistic versus collective grabbing on a mass level that used to be versus what is now. I give you the example, me coming into this station, I see 3 pastors who know each other well. I didn't know either one of them. So what happens, and I'm just using an example, not to say that because they embrace me, but what happens to the one that isn't known? versus the ones who do know each other. Because
I need you to hold that thought.
Okay.
And we're going to come back and explore that some more. And we also want to talk about who's coming to your church and who's not coming to your churches. Yeah. We'll be back on Straight No Chaser. This is Michael Eugene Johnson. Stick around.
Right here. Well, how about while playing pinball? And what about doing a game of pool?
Located in beautiful downtown Baltimore at 112 East Lexington Street, Next Phase Cafe offers a comfortable and decorative atmosphere that will satisfy everyone's palate. If you're stopping in for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you'll find it a very unique experience. Next Phase specializes in great Southern cuisine such as crab cakes, bayou pasta, catfish, barbecue ribs, and of course this famous cornbread, all prepared for by a professional and courteous staff. So for a great meal, great entertainment, great drinks, and just a great time with some great people, stop in at Next Phase Cafe. For more information, call 410-449-3232 or visit our website at www.nextphasecafe.com.
Hit the floor, you're not up in here, then hit the street. Let's start off right back in this party high. Party high. Come catch the vibe and we can groove all night. We can do it. Let's do this now and show how we go live. We go live. Come feel this vibe and we can dance on through the night. We can do it. That's right. We be grooving. Let's glide. It's been proven. That's right. Keep it moving and dance on through the night. Now she's back in.
Welcome back to Straight No Chaser. I'm your host, Michael Eugene Johnson, and I am really having a great time today because I am with people, ministers, pastors, senior pastors, temporary fill-ins, whatever we want to call. The bottom line is these are folks who are part of our community. The black church is nothing to just sneeze at. It is what moved my family, moved this city, and continue to move the black community. It's got different layers now and different levels, and I know that you were getting ready to finish up, so we wanted to make sure that you got a chance to complete your thought, if you wish.
No problem.
Yes,
It's more
sir.
so just saying that with the black church, we have to be very intentional on reaching out more because many are not coming back to the church. And being in truth, and bless God for great and good pastors and good leaders. But the church has had a dark cloud over its head for some time in the eyes of the community because of some indiscretions that have been uncovered over the years that has put a bit of a bad taste in people's mouths and their lack of trust. And I believe that is something we need to rebuild with credible character, with persons in the church who don't live in that community. Because many churches are attended by persons that don't live in the community, but outside of the community. and letting the community know that the church that's in that community is a part of them, and they are a part of that church, even if they don't attend it.
And that's important too, Dr. Slayton. I mean, I think that when we talked earlier, when I said about the migration, you know, the migration of African Americans in Baltimore City can start in Southwest Baltimore and goes up Fulton Avenue and goes up Park Heights and goes, but it hasn't always been the churches that has always followed the migration. And so today we have a lot of areas that are more empty. And because people have to drive into the church, you may have a sense that people are not attending church as much. And I think that a lot of them are migrating to churches that are closer by. I did grow up in the time, you know, when you would look outside and you would see families, literally. And because of segregation, but families of people going to church. And it's interesting because I live north of Northern Parkway, and I see that with a lot of the Orthodox Jewish community. But I understand, though, this is where they've said we're living, and this is where we will practice. What do we do? Do the churches need to start migrating more with the people, or do they start to maybe, as the bishop said, go and attract the folk that live immediately or around the particular facilities or the particular church at that time?
One of the things that we've noticed through gentrification and the way communities dynamics are changing, a lot of your historically black churches are in communities that have changed.
Yes.
And the new neighbors don't appreciate us showing up on Sundays and taking up parking. So that's one issue. The gospel has not changed. The gospel message has not changed.
Yes.
The packaging has to change. The utilization of technology and the different things we do to appeal has to change. But I think there are two other components I think that stand out for sort of what we see as far as the attraction to the faith within the black church. One, if you consider 1968 Judge Joe Howard, not Joe Howard, but he's running for office.
Running for office.
The popular party here said there's no way he can win. It's a laughingstock. Preachers came together. Preachers, a couple preachers literally sat on roofs to protect him overnight. And they went into individual churches, and although the law dictated that churches could not endorse, candidates or what have you, I've actually seen the actual printed bullseye document that they got into every church the Sunday before the election, and they single shot and he won. But the point is, we all had something in common we were fighting for. That's number one. We're more. Disintegration is the book by Eugene Robinson. We're not a monolith. We're in different places. So that's being one thing. But then the other thing is, let's have a real conversation about the impact of white evangelicals on Christianity, right?
Yes.
So this generation is different. My generation, 70s and 80s, oh man, I wouldn't have been no slave. I would have did this, right? Nobody could have did that to me. That's what they say. This generation is a little bit different. They can't seem to understand what it is that causes black folk to worship the same God that the folks who waved the Bible on January 6, 2021, what do we have in common? Unless we find a way to speak to the issues that are impacting their lives on a daily basis, we shouldn't expect a large influx of them. What has always drawn folks to the black church is our ability to stand on truth and justice. And I would argue that white evangelicals are doing a great disservice to universal Christianity.
Dr. I guess some of the questions that we've been putting together, first thing I want to make this absolutely clear, is not about what's wrong with the black church, because I think that there's a lot of wrong with all churches. I think that listening to a lot of the young people, they say exactly similar to what you just said. Why would you, the same book, this and that. But they also don't believe, a lot of them are not going to majority African-American churches. Why should these young folk come to the black church? What's the black church? What is it?
Well, Michael, you raised the point. It's a context-driven reality, right? So when we talk about the definitive article, Black Church, we are really talking about a rubric underneath which there is great distinction and diversity. Not all Black churches are alike. What they share is that their parishioners very often have a unique experience within this particular context that's going to be nuanced by where you live. All right, let's look at Baltimore City, for example. Baltimore City, in many ways, has been the crucible of some of the greatest hostility perpetuated against Black folk, starting with redlining and the legacy of it that continues even to this day. And so the nuance of what Black churches in Baltimore may need to respond to is going to be tied to what's happening right outside the doors where that church is physically located. If we were to take let's say the neighborhood health profiles, and we look at the rankings of neighborhoods, when we have a 20-year life expectancy gap between a child born in Upton Druid Heights today and a child born in Roland Park today, that's a contextual issue. And so many times we start trying to figure out, why is there not behavioral conformity to how folks carry out their expression of religious intent? The truth of the matter is, as technology has changed, as the pandemic has shifted the way we moved, as the situation is different in terms of how it's carried out in practice, the way the Black church has to execute also has had to change. So we're using everything from social media to what we used to call outreach, right? So we're going to where the people are instead of necessarily expecting the people to come where we are. That's the difference in the motif, the modality of how we have to function. But we cannot lose sight of the fact is the issue of buildings and Black churches is a fairly recent phenomenon. The Black church as an entity started in the hush harbors, back in the cut. After our ancestors had to pick from can't see to can't see, then they had to steal away back into the wood clearing, turn that washboard upside down so they could have their ring shout and not disturb the master, and make him aware that when we get back and we start singing the spirituals in the fields, talking about the freedom train is a-coming, that wouldn't alert the master that we getting ready to get up out of here.
That's right.
But it told everybody else that the Underground Railroad was on the move. We have to remember that the Black church at its best is an organism of resistance that we've allowed to become tied to physical placement. But what really anchors the Black church is what's going on with Black people. If their conditions aren't changing, then you can say the Black church is not connected. If we're not focused on, and remember, Dr. King didn't have he didn't have a majority of Black churches rolling with him in Montgomery. He had to have a critical mass. And so the real question is, just like we look at our colleagues from other communities, they don't get unanimity in terms of how they operate. Do we get critical mass to be able to move the needle and change the dial in terms of how the conditions of the people that are connected, whether they come to our church or not? The grandmother in my church has grandchildren who are trying to figure out how they're going to deal with homeschooling and the digital divide, how they're going to be able to pay for college when you can't even get forgiveness of student loan debt. How are we going to be able to get access to the ballot box when they already over-policed and they jammed up all the time? That's not something, that ain't a Sunday morning thing, that's an everyday thing. And so the church is an everyday reality, not just what happens on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock.
Do we all want to agree that, let's stay local, that Westmore would not be governor if it wasn't for the Black church?
Westmore, who else you want to call? Let's go down the road.
We can start with Obama.
Well, we can go all the way back.
Take me.
In Maryland, let's talk about Perrin Mitchell.
Yeah, absolutely. 70,
Right?
72, 71.
Let's talk about Kurt Schmoke, first elected Black mayor.
That's right.
Let's talk about that, because the conversation that I've had is that those folks who wanted to serve in public office had to have audiences with Black faith leadership. And we cannot have this conversation in Baltimore and not invoke the goon squad.
Absolutely.
We cannot talk about the activism of we can't talk about activism and leave out the IMA. We've got to have the conversation about the ministers' conference. That is something that we have to remember, that Baltimore is only what it is today because there was a resistance and a movement and a push and a press from a Black church that didn't have everybody in the community coming. But what we did have was critical mass to change the dynamic.
Well, why? I mean, with the problems that we're having, let's absolutely clear that the education system in Baltimore is at the worst right now. When do I hear the religious community, the black religious community, say we have a problem?
Well,
I haven't heard that.
Well, I think it's 2017. The school system proposed setting the minimum GPA requirement for athletic participation to 1.75.
Yeah.
So I went over. I took, God rest his soul, the late Dr. Boyer Freeman. We went and signed up to testify. We were the only people there to testify that 1.75 was just unacceptable. What makes the church powerful, I believe, is not just the preacher, but the activism and the organization of the pew.
And I need you to hold that thought again. See, gets so good right at the time when it's time to pay my bills. So give me a few minutes and please come back and finish. This is Straight No Chaser. This is my inaugural show, and I don't care if I don't have any other shows. This is the one that's going to always be in my heart and soul. We'll be right back.
Located in beautiful downtown Baltimore at 112 East Lexington Street, Next Phase Cafe offers a comfortable and decorative atmosphere that will satisfy everyone's palate. If you're stopping in for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you'll find it a very unique experience. Next Phase specializes in great southern cuisine such as crab cakes, bayou pasta, catfish, barbecue ribs, and of course this famous cornbread, all prepared for by a professional and courteous staff. So for a great meal, great entertainment, great drinks, and just a great time with some great people, stop in at Next Phase Cafe. For more information, call 410-449-3232 or visit our website at www.nextphasecafe.com.
And I love myself, yeah. I wanna tell you that fabulous but not flawless is me. I'm gonna tell you that fabulous but not flawless is free. I would find myself saying I'm not better, I'm just different, when in fact sometimes I'm better. I can confidently say that.
Well, here we are. We're here. We're having an incredible conversation today. This is our inaugural show. This is Straight No Chaser. I'm your host, Michael Eugene Johnson. Bishop Smith, Dr. Slayton. I'm not going to mess it up this time.
Yearly.
Yeah, I was going to say Dr. Yearly. Yearly, with dot and L. But this is incredible, and we're going to really go as deep as we can in this last one. You were finishing up about the schools when I had made the statement that I don't hear or see a lot of not just the black churches, but the churches in general to come and say that our kids are being miseducated.
And I think to that point, again, I was pointing out the instance where the GPA minimum was lowered to 175. I testified they did eventually limit it to 2.0, which I think was insufficient because that was the same year that the NCAA made their minimum requirement for athletic participation at 2.3. Whether or not faith communities decide to engage the issues of the day, I think has to move beyond the expectation of race. One of the most powerful faith voices in the state is the Catholic Church. One of the most well-financed instruments of faith advocacy is the United Methodist Church. When those moments happen in public life and institutions began to enact policy that impacts the lives of future generations, it can no longer just be dependent, which I think is what we're asking in this, where is the black church? The Archbishop has to show up. The bishop of this denomination, folks who don't just look black. That's what King was writing from Birmingham jail. Why do you have issues with it just being me? I need you to be here too. If we all believe in the same ideas, we should all be working together too. And just to sort of heavy-handedly lay that at the feet of the black church. The black church is doing a lot of stuff. They're doing a lot of work. They've been doing it for a long time. And we literally would love to have some support from folks who believe in the same values that we do.
But I do believe that the black community has always looked at the black church, though, as the spiritual police for us, as our civil rights police for us. I mean, this is just the historic nature in which we live. Now, things are maybe different today. I mean, I think today there's been a question, our bishop, that there's starting to show a slight decline of African-American men in the African-American churches or in the black churches. And some of the comments that we had gotten from some of the folks who had gave us that question was that they don't hear the church speaking to them. Is the church speaking to the black man today?
I believe that the church is speaking to the black man. Do I think that the church is speaking enough to the black man historically? No, but I believe more so now there are. I believe that the presence of the black man is definitely, we understand there's a major need for their presence to be there. Husbands to be with their wives, fathers to be with their children, even just in the capacity of just leadership and involvement, because we understand that that male presence does have strength to it. And so more so now, I believe that as beyond just men's ministries, but the message is being targeted towards men even the more. Even just this past Sunday, we had Father's Day, which is to speak to men. But I think that we need to speak to men more than just on a Father's Day. And I do see that happening more. How we still get them and grip them and grab them and hold them is still, I believe, a network that's going to be required. And how do we go about doing that? But right now, I believe there's an effort that's pushing forward towards that. We know that in other communities, other cultures, the men are very prevalent. Men are very present. The question is, what is the method that's being used to grab them and hold them? And I believe part of that is empowering them and to equip them, where culture and society has negated the black presence, the black man in the black community. And I believe that is one of the contributing factors that will help that.
Well, then we would have to then, to keep that going, is we're sitting here right now with three male pastors, ministers, bishops. How is the evolution of women leaders within the black church? Or is there an evolution of women leaders in the black church?
I believe there is an evolution.
And I'd like everybody to answer this one, too.
Of women in the black church.
Yes, sir.
Undeniably. One, for many churches, our churches are made up mostly of women. They're present, they're there, they're active, they're involved. And if we're going to get things taken care of or handled or do ministry or even do things in the community, we need bodies. We as pastors cannot do them individually or alone. We need help, we need assistance. And most times, if I have to use when I had a ministry in Virginia that I started. It was not a large ministry, but you want to do ministry. So you have to use what you have that is present. And I go back to you equipping you power persons to do what needs to be done. So with women in the pulpit, women in the congregation, women in leadership, women being not deaconess, but deacons, is becoming very prevalent. And I go to this aspect of, you know, when God says, he says, I pour out my spirit upon all flesh. I pour it out upon my sons and daughters. The lack of presence or utilization of the women in the church is not a God factor. It was a man factor. But now we're in a space where the gifts that are in women, the thoughts, ideas, the creativity, the empowering of women is very present in the church as it is in the corporate America. We see that rise, that evolution that has come through. And so we're having to make sure that we are respecting that space for them as well, especially even for the church to continue to survive, because the ones that are there are the women.
Brother Michael, let's be real clear. There would be no institutional black church were it not for the commitment of black women.
Yeah.
Let's be real clear on that. And it's not just in terms of roles and titles, but if you think about the economic infrastructure, what drove the ability of black women to help raise the resources. Let's go back and look at the Montgomery bus boycott and how they funded that, expecting it to die within a couple of weeks. It ends up running over a year. How you needed the support and the role of women to be able to do that. Don't miss that. I think very often we buy into our version of the Southern Baptist Convention's dilemma when they try to say that there's certain roles that women cannot play in the church. The truth of the matter is that it was my mama and my grandmama who were introducing me to church. Why? Because my grandfather, who they had a farm, he had time to go to church. He had to be out in the field. The truth of the matter is that what was going on in life very often disrupted the ability of folks to be there. And sometimes there was this angst, quite honestly, about this tension between black men and a black male preacher that wasn't really kind of reconciled because there was this disconnect. It's much too deep. So the appearances, that's why it is not who's going to come to me, it's who am I going to go reach? Who am I trying to reach and make that connection that way? You may not get them in the building. That's not really the objective. We sometimes confuse the role of the church with somehow creating these membership roles that we like to use by comparison. Doc, how many folk you seeing on Sunday? How many folk you seeing on Sunday? No, what kind of difference are you making in the qualitative outputs of folks' lives, and let the rest of that stuff kind of fall where it may? Because at the end of the day, if you got a lot of folks in your building, but you're irrelevant to what's going on, to what's happening in their lives when they leave that building, then you don't really have church anyway. You have a gathering. And so let's be real clear on what that impact is. Otherwise, we start confusing people in the pews with power in the movement.
Dr. Slade?
I just keep it simple. There should be a level of repentance. All too often, what we saw was the male figure within the structured church begin to imitate the behaviors of the oppressor. And it was used on women. And Dr. Yeary is absolutely right. One only needs to look at what happened in Montgomery. You take the power and the prophetic voice of the preacher and you parallel it with the advocacy and the organization skills of those women in the pews, you can change an entire community. And I think it's ironic that you look at what Joanne Gibson Robinson was able to do with Dr. King there, and you fast forward some 60, 70 years, and you look at what happened in Atlanta, Georgia with Raphael Warnock. Unfortunately, we still haven't made the progress yet because the sister who organized to get those voters in place, she came up short. So still there's a certain level of repentance that we have to come to for the way we treated our sisters. I'm speaking from my truth because the scripture talks about you should remember your mother Eunice and Lois. Well, my mama's name is Lois. And I've always argued with them that nobody in my family would have any idea of what our religious trajectory would have been if it were not for the roles of the women in our history. They passed the stories along. And to continue to act as if they don't have a place is almost unforgivable.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and when I said, you know, like I said about the evolution, I knew at the end of the day, you know, it was my mama who introduced all of us and made sure we went after my father had probably worked for you know, feed 11 kids. You're working. And so it was great that we had that moment. You know, in a few minutes that we have, I want to give each one of you individually an opportunity to tell, you know, about where you are, your church, the church, or what you got going on. You know, we always say that at the end of the day, for me, a good pastor is still a good salesman. You know, how do you sell and be religious? How do I get it? Because I've had my doubts from time to time to time, you know, and you all come from these legendary places, you know, Reverend Bascom and the Goon Squad and all of that. And, you know, my family was not the ones who might have been in front of the civil rights, but my daddy was cooking the fried chicken so they could eat. So, Bishop?
For me, I'm at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church at 430 East Belvedere Avenue in East Baltimore. I'm presently serving as the interim pastor there. So basically, I'm the in-between as they're looking for their new pastor. My goal and assignment there has just been to keep the people afloat, one, and to prepare them for their new leader that comes in. Oftentimes, when a pastor is no longer there, the infrastructure begins to collapse for various reasons. My effort is to assist with that structure maintaining and keeping the people spiritually gathered and meeting the needs that need to be met. For me, when it comes to introducing or getting someone to be active or becoming to where we are, not where I am, where we are, I believe in building rapport. I'm a people person, old, middle, young, making sure that I make that connection with everyone. For me, Jesus was very touchable. And so with that being said, that's what I make the effort to be.
Thank you, Bishop.
Well, I find myself in the crucible of one of the most amazing black churches ever to be found this side of heaven. Douglas Memorial Community Church is a unique space and place that is extended generosity to only 5 people in its history to be able to serve as pastor. Frederick Douglass, not the abolitionist for whom the church is named, followed by Reverend Dr. Marion Curtis Bascom Sr. of the Goon Squad and the first appointed fire commissioner in Baltimore City, followed by Brad Braxton, who came and did a tremendous work and is now the president of Chicago Theological Seminary. And after Reverend Dr. Braxton was Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, who left Douglas to go pastor Ebenezer and is now amongst the 100 in the United States Senate. They allowed a country boy born in Georgia, kind of raised in Chicago, to come here and to continue a tremendous work that includes housing and program support for youth and families, and along with doing the church work. But the political activism, the civic engagement, this congregation has cultivated my midlife crisis of being a litigator, as well as a preacher. I have one foot in the pulpit, one in the public square. And so now we continue to do that work right there on the corner of Lafayette and Madison, where we've been since 1929. The neighborhood has changed, but we have not. Still committed to the community and still doing what we believe God has called us to do.
Thank you.
Kevin Slayton again, North Waterpole United Methodist Church, East Baltimore, right at the entry of Morgan State University, also teaching at Lancaster Theological Seminary and doing my advocacy work around fiscal and tax policy with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. A book coming out very shortly. Go to www.drkaslayton.com. The book is entitled Politically Preaching, All Politics is Local to the Black Church.
I'd like to get a copy of that. Look, thank you everyone for coming. This is my inaugural show. I believe we'll be having a few more shows. I don't think but if it's the last Sunday, it's StraightNoChaser. I'm your host, Mike Eugene Johnson. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and may God bless all of you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Located in beautiful downtown Baltimore at 112 East Lexington Street, Next Phase Cafe offers a comfortable and decorative atmosphere that will satisfy everyone's palate. If you're stopping in for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you'll find it a very unique experience. Next Phase specializes in great Southern cuisine such as crab cakes, bayou pasta, catfish, barbecue ribs, and of course this famous cornbread, all prepared for by a professional and courteous staff. So for a great meal, great entertainment, great drinks, and just a great time with some great people, stop in at Next Phase Cafe. For more information, call 410-449-3232 or visit our website at www.nextphasecafe.com.